Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome. This is a session about Google Cloud Storage. We're going to try to make this a regular office hour session, and so the idea here will be to share a quick tech talk, which I'll present in a moment, and to give you guys a chance to ask any questions you might have. We've got a moderator, a list of questions that people have already submitted things to, and we also have a chat window in the Hangout. So if you see that little chat button, you can open that up to submit your questions as well. I want to introduce Vile Ikas, who's on the Hangout with us. Vile is the technical lead for the cloud storage engineering team.
Hi guys.
Say hi.
Welcome.
So as you're submitting if you have questions and you want to send them in the chat window, Vile will be taking a look at that as well as helping me out with any live questions you have. Okay, let's start. Let me share my screen here. Okay, is everyone seeing the slide that I have here that says Google Cloud Storage, kind of a title slide? Okay. So, as I said, the agenda is 30 minutes on tech, quick tech talk, and then Q&A. The tech talk topic will be Cname redirection and website configuration. Those are really kind of two different sub-features, but they go together nicely, so we'll try to cover both of those. Start with a little bit of terminology. So Google Cloud Storage is Google's way of making our internal storage infrastructure available for application developers. A lot of people often confuse it with Google Drive, which is more of a consumer cloud storage capability. So there are two different products, and we're not talking about Google Drive today. We're talking about Google Cloud Storage. Within Google Cloud Storage, we kind of divide up the world into buckets and objects. So buckets are object containers. They're essentially somewhat like folders or directories, if you're familiar with those concepts. And objects themselves are the contents. So they're kind of like files in a file system. And the URLs shown here are depicting kind of the syntax you would use to specify a bucket or an object, respectively, using a URL. And one of the nice features of cloud storage is that when you create these resources, you can programmatically access them, but you can also access them with HTTP by pasting a URL into your standard web browser. And this is giving an example of what the URLs would look like for a bucket and an object. We have this notion of directories, and it's a little bit tricky because technically the storage subsystem is two-level hierarchy. There's simply buckets and objects. And the notion of a directory in this context is purely abstract. So there's not an actual formal directory or folder in the system, but rather if you created an object with a / delimited name, sometimes we think of those intermediate nodes in the name as directories because they kind of look like file system directories. They're technically not. So if you look at the second URL there, the storage.googleapis.com /bucket/directory/object. That's actually the name of an object with whose name is directory/object. That compound name is the object's name, and then bucket is the container. Next, we have the CNames, and so CNames are a special type of record in the DNS system. And CNames are used to alias one name to another. So when you do a DNS lookup, if the name you're looking up has an alias, you'll get back, depending on the configuration, the CName alias, and then you can resolve the alias name to find the actual destination. So it's basically a way of redirecting from one name to another. And we'll talk about why you might want to do that in a second. The last topic or definition here is static websites. And these are websites that have no active server-side logic. So if you're used to thinking about PHP or Python or Perl kind of, or Java, probably more likely doing the active runtime logic of templateizing or doing database lookups or something active when you're fetching web pages. Static web pages are those that don't actually do anything on the server side. It doesn't mean that they're totally static in the sense that they're not really doing anything. A lot of websites can do client-side dynamic things that are quite elaborate, and we'll see an example of a site of a page like that, or really a site like that, in a few minutes. So Cname redirection. Why would you want to do that? It enables you to create names or to associate names with your storage objects that are more natural and more meaningful. So by default, you can create resources in Google Cloud Storage which are accessible through this URI, storage.googleapis.com. And so you can qualify your bucket to be meaningful to your particular company or your application or whatever, however you want to name the bucket. But at the end of the day, you would end up giving out these URLs that are vectored off of storage.googleapis.com, and you might prefer to have the resources be named with your own company's domain name. And that's exactly what Cname redirection lets you do. Create your a URL like the first example there, like my.company.com/whatever resource, instead of having to use the googleapis.com domain as the root of your path. And by the way, if anybody has questions as we're going along, feel free to just kind of jump in. We have a small enough group here that that should be fine. In a nutshell, the procedure for using this Cname redirection feature is to obtain a domain name if you don't already have one. You need to go through a few steps to verify ownership of the domain. So that basically entails proving to Google that you actually have the rights to that domain name. And the reason there is obviously we can't let anybody have ownership of buckets in the namespace of somebody else who might actually be the rightful owner of that domain name. And so there are 3 different ways you can do that. I won't go into the details here, but the easiest one entails putting a file with a special value up on serving a file with a particular value on the website associated with the domain name in question. And that proves that you actually have ownership because you were able to save that file at that URL. And then after you verify ownership of the domain name, you would configure the DNS directory system to actually have the Cname record, which is aliasing your domain name to this kind of pattern, this c.storage.googleapis.com. So that's a special URL that gets routed into Google that's specifically there to do the right thing with mapping the Cname into the resource relative to Google's namespace. With that, users can then use your company names, like I mentioned earlier, and they can you can advertise your resources in a way that's really natural. It looks like it's in your own website rather than in Google's website space. One caveat to know about is that Cname redirection is supported only for HTTP, not HTTPS. So, question? We're up to 16 viewers, which is great. I'll just repeat if anybody on the call wants to add questions, feel free to in the chat window. And also, if you're live streaming via YouTube, there is a actually one thing I didn't mention. If you look at the very first slide, these slides are available right now through tinyurl.com/gcs-office-hours. So if you'd like to follow along with the slides, you're welcome to. And we also have a moderated question queue, which is down here. So the page that you came in on, either to live stream the video or to join the Hangout, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a moderated set of questions. So feel free to post there as well, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards in the second half of the talk. Any questions before I pick up again? Okay. Let's zip ahead here. So we covered Cname redirection, and I'm actually going to show you an example of that shortly. But now I would like to switch gears to website configuration. And so what is website configuration? It's basically a feature that we've added recently that gives you the ability to serve an entire website directly from Google Cloud Storage. Why is this useful? Why would you care about this? There are a few reasons. One is that dynamic logic in web applications is increasingly client-side based, and so you can do some very cool things purely in JavaScript without having to do much work at all, with having essentially a static server-side component. And in fact, it's a nice pattern for building your web applications because it scales very well because you're harnessing the capacity, the computing capacity of the clients, rather than having to multiply capacity to serve a number of users on a small set of servers. Some websites just happen to be very simple. If you're an App Engine user, for example, and you've ever wanted to build a small app that just kind of serves up some relatively simple content, and you wondered, why do I have to build a whole application just to do this? Well, you don't have to anymore, and this feature I'm talking about is a perfect alternative for that type of task. It's ideal for caching of read-mostly websites. So if you have something like a blog where you might post an article once a day or something once in a few hours or something on that order. This is a great way to cache that site. So anytime the content changes, you can post a copy of the entire blog or the website or just the changed components to Google Cloud Storage, and then serve that up really nicely without having. I'll explain what I mean by why it's great to serve that up so well in the next bullet. But before I move to that, I just wanted to mention that there are WordPress plugins out there which make this sort of thing easy for caching blogs to off-site readers, basically, or off-site storage servers. And if anyone out there is interested, I think this would be a great project for building an app on top of Google Cloud Storage to extend one of those plugins or to create a new one to push WordPress content over to Google Cloud Storage. And the reason why it's useful to push your content, your blog content, you might be wondering, well, why, if I have a blog and it's serving up content every day, why do I care? Why would I want to push cache copies of it on cloud storage? And the reason is scalability. If your blog is successful, if you ever get /dotted or post something that attracts a lot of interest, your usage is going to spike, probably very suddenly. And what typically happens is people who deploy blogs on relatively small footprints where you might be paying per server or per virtual server, you can't tolerate the spike in traffic sometimes. And that's really bad because when you most need the capacity at the point in time when your blog is suddenly the most popular it's ever been, it falls over and it fails to respond appropriately. And so it's really nice to be able to just dynamically absorb all that traffic and perform equally well under very high load as well as the norm. And that's what you get with deploying not just a blog but any static website on Google Cloud Storage. You get virtually unlimited scaling, you get incredibly high performance, and you get a global footprint where people can read this content, access your website all around the world, thanks to the fact that it's Google Cloud Storage is deployed on Google's global worldwide network. So you get all these benefits that you wouldn't have if you were in a more constrained web hosting or blog serving type environment. So a few words. Is there a question? A little bit about how website configuration works. So we've added 2 new metadata properties, and these are applied on a per bucket basis. So you'll typically define a bucket, and that will be kind of the root of your website. And you'll associate with that bucket a main page suffix and a not found page property. When you've set those, if someone does a get object either on the bucket itself or on what we refer to as a directory, kind of a virtual directory underneath that bucket, we will look for an object underneath that path with the specified name that you've set for main page suffix. And if it exists, we'll deliver it up automatically. So the nice thing about this is you don't have to actually distribute your URLs with the form pathname/index.html or whatever the name is of the file that contains the kind of the home page or the default page. It works kind of naturally if you're used to Apache or any other popular web server. You get a default page that gets served up automatically, and you can specify which page it is as well, so it doesn't have to be index.html. It can be any name you like. And equivalently, you can do the same thing with this not found page metadata. And that, as you might guess from the name, is giving you the ability to serve up a page that is provided in response whenever a resource that's requested is not available. Essentially the 404 capability. Let's see. So the other thing is, so these this metadata defines names, but it doesn't define content. So you actually upload objects into those names in order to have the content of the page delivered, and I'll show you how that all works in a second. So the procedure for doing this is to upload content into a bucket. You have to make sure the ACLs are set according to your intended access permission. So if you're, for example, doing, again, a blog where you want everybody in the world to be able to access the content, you'd set the public read access control so that everybody can see your content anywhere. You want to create and upload default pages for the bucket, and optionally for any directories you care about. And then you may, in addition, want to create custom 404 page, a custom 404 page as well, if you're interested in that. And then you'll set one or both of the following metadata values, and I already covered that. You can do that either via the XML API or with the GSUtil tool. The GSUtil tool makes it very easy, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. This is a pictorial diagram of the logic that's happening kind of behind the scenes when you actually submit a request. And I'm not going to walk through this. We can if people want to drill down into it, but this picture comes from our online documentation, and you'll see at the end of the talk there a list of resources you can use to read more about this feature. But I'd like to jump into the demo because I think it's always a little bit easier to explain something interactively. So let me switch over here. You guys still seeing my screen? You should be seeing a shell window.
It's delayed.
Okay. So as part of this talk, I created a new domain name, and it's called Cloud and Clear. I thought that would be a cute name for a blog at some point, so I just created this domain name a couple of days ago, and as you can see, I was able to create a bucket for it. So I named the bucket after the domain name. It's cloudandclear.com. I'm using GSUtil. For those who haven't seen it, it's a command line utility that lets me do all sorts of things. If I do help, it'll show you all the kinds of things you can do here. But it makes it very easy to upload, download, list, modify, set access permissions, etc. on my Google Cloud Storage resources. So what I've done is I have created this bucket, and in order to create this bucket, I had to prove that I owned the domain name. So I went through the procedure of doing that, and minus B here. There's information about the bucket. So I went through the process of registering the domain name, proving that I owned it, and then I created the domain name, but it's virtually empty right now. And so if I go to a web browser and I enter that name, oh, and I did set the Cname in the DNS system as well. So when you enter cloudandclear.com, it's being redirected automatically to Google Cloud Storage. But the problem is there's nothing in that directory. And one more thing, if I show you the way that you get and set the metadata for website configuration can be done through a special command in GSUtil called getWebConfig. So if I enter that command, cloudandclear.com, here's the configuration I've set on this page, on this bucket. So by default, I want the main page suffix to be index.html. So if there's a file or an object index.html, I want that served up anytime someone does a get on the bucket. And if you can't find the requested object underneath that bucket, I want Google Cloud Storage to serve up the contents of 404.html. Now, problem is neither of those objects have been uploaded to this bucket. And so when I access the bucket right now, I've got the configuration set that says, by default, if you don't specify a particular object, serve up index.html. There is no index.html. There's no such key in that bucket, and so I'm getting an error message. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to upload index.html, and it should make my problem go away. Now the way I'm going to upload it is I have something called upload home, I call it, which uploads really two files. Since I showed you the configuration is enabling both the main page suffix and the not found page, I'm going to upload both in one shot. So this script is copying home.html and 404.html to index, well, home to index and 404 to 404. And then it sets the ACLs on both to public read. So if I run upload home, it's kind of my home environment. It's setting both index.html and 404. So now, if I refresh, I get the contents. I should have shown you what the contents of that file was. So index.html, whoops, is a very simple page with a header and one link to a subdomain /pool. So as you see, it's now serving that up. And I didn't have to say cloud and clear /index.html. I could have done that, but I didn't need to because I got picked up the default setting here. If I instead ask for something that doesn't exist, I get a 404 page. That's my 404 page, actually. That's not Google's. And if I show you the 404, it looks like this. I copied this from Google's that broken robot page that some of you have seen before. But I actually crafted this myself, uploaded it into 404.html, and that's what I'm getting when I request something that doesn't exist, like foo. So let's go back to the top. And I have this link on the index.html page to pool demo. And if I hover over that, you can see, hopefully you can see at the bottom of the window. Let me raise it a little bit just in case it's cutting off. If I hover on that, you see at the bottom of the window it's showing you the link underneath it. It's cloudandclear.com/pool. Now I didn't upload pool, so if I do that, I'm getting my error page that I already showed you. So what I'd like to do now is upload pool, which is essentially a static website. So I've got a script called upload_pool. And all that does is it uses gsutil to copy -r means recursively from the current directory to cloudandclear.com/pool. So it's creating a subdirectory with a recursive contents of this website that you'll see what it does in a minute. And then it sets the ACL again to public read because I want everybody in the world to be able to access this. So I'm going to run upload/pool, and it's a significant sized website. But the interesting thing about this website, it's completely static on the server side. There's no server-side logic, but you'll see it's quite dynamic in terms of the client. So now that I've set this, I should be able to click on Pool Demo, and I probably need to refresh the page because the previous result was cached. And that's what I get. So and I'll show you there's more to that, but let me go back to the main URL and show that just works now. I can either click on that link and get to the pool thing, or I can specify pool explicitly myself and get to it. Now what's happening is that pool is a subdirectory underneath the cloudandclear.com bucket. And in that subdir is an index.html file. That didn't exist. Then when I went to the /pool URL, I would be getting a 404 not found. And I can just show you that very quickly by displaying the contents of cloudandclear.com/pool/index.html. There it is. So what this site is actually doing is downloading an app that's got some pretty cool JavaScript with audio and visual stuff to it. Like I can click the space bar and I approach the pool ball, and then I can hold down the space bar, and it actually has audio files attached to it, so it sort of simulates the sound effects of the pool. If I click on space, it brings me to the cue ball. I can rearrange the table to my liking. I'm not a very good pool player, so I won't do this very well, but then I can do the same thing, hold down the space bar and blast away. And it would be nice if I actually got a ball into a pocket here, because it makes a cool sound, but I'm probably not a good enough pool player to do that. I'll give it one more try and then we'll move on. People are probably laughing at pool players right now, or laughing at me, I'm sure, but yay! Okay, so that was, anyway, you're welcome to try that. And one cute thing about these slides, let me go back to the start presentation thing. And sorry, it keeps bringing me back to the beginning. But one cute thing about this slide is that this is clickable. This image on the slide is clickable. So if you're watching at home, walking through these this presentation right now, you can click on the image of the pool table, and it'll take you. It should take you right to the demo, and you can try it out for yourself. It's kind of fun. So that was it. Just to kind of recap what we did there, because we did a lot of things. We set up Cname redirection so that this cloudandclear.com imaginary domain name property that I created was serving resources directly from Google Cloud Storage with the names I like instead of something that was forced on me. Then I configured the website settings for the bucket that I created, modeling the domain name. And then I uploaded content, and I'm now able to serve websites directly from that bucket, as well as subdirectories like that /pool path from that bucket. So I effectively have a little website distribution system here that's like pretty much infinitely scalable and high performance and global and all that good stuff. Quick list of resources here for people who want to read more. There's a link here for the console. That's the developer's console is kind of the entry point for all of our cloud products. So if you want to get access to cloud storage as well as anything else, App Engine, Compute Engine, all our different products, that's kind of the entry point, as well as where you administer and set up your projects. There's a product description site, and our documentation is quite good, so I'd recommend that third link there if you want to learn more specifically about cloud storage. The feature I've covered today is on this link here, website configuration, and lastly you see a link to the demo that you can use again to try yourself. That's pretty much it, right on the half hour. So what I wanted to do next is just to kind of open things up to your questions. Either we can take questions from the moderated list or the chat window, or ideally maybe we'll first give people a crack who are in the Hangout right now. So let me undo the screen sharing here. And by the way, we're open and actually quite interested in not just questions, but if you have feedback, if something's not working right for you, you think we should be doing something differently, please let us know. We're interested in that stuff quite a bit as well. So yeah, why don't I open it up to the Hangout first. And don't all jump at once, please. Anything from the Hangout? Going once? Okay, if you guys get interested later, just jump right in at any time, please. I'm going to switch to the moderator queue. Is there a way to, let's see, the top rated one I think is a question about, well no, actually it's fair. Is there a way to back up Google Docs to Google Storage directly? There's no direct way in the sense of like having a button to press kind of thing. The way to do this would probably be to write an application to do it. We had a request on the discussion group for cloud storage recently that was in the space of how to move data from a spreadsheet, a Google Drive spreadsheet, into Google Cloud Storage. And in answering that question, I learned about some AppScript, if you're familiar with that capability. It's a way to write JavaScript-like code that manipulates Google Docs content. So there's a way to use AppScript to move data between the two, but it still boils down to writing an app to do that. There's no kind of direct pass-through type capability that I'm aware of. Let's keep going. Can there be a multi-step verification process enforced on Google Storage before allowing files on GCS to be removed? Belay, want to take a crack at that? You can say no.
Sorry, I just have to get unmuted there. So yeah, right now there is no way to do this, but we're always looking at ways of improving that. I assume it would be some kind of a two-factor authentication. Maybe the person is not here, so, but I assume that's what they mean. So we would have to go ahead and see how much interest there is, and hopefully in the future we can investigate in adding that option. But right now there's not. Right,
and there's a group that people can join if you're interested in like submitting more detail on what you envision this to look like. I guess the other thing you could do is just add to this. Whoever posted this, Brandon from Sacramento, if you'd care to just add to this question with a little bit more information about how you saw this working, that would help us figure out, how it might look, how it might be implemented. What are some tools you would recommend non-developers use to interact with GCS? So the first comment I would make is that Google Cloud Storage is primarily focusing on application developers. So that's really the target audience for the product initially, but there are some ways to interact with it, and without having to write code, for example. And the two tools that I would mention are, one is the one I've already shown you guys with the gsutil command, and the other one would be there's a web user interface. The name of the tool is the Google Cloud Storage Manager, and it's available through you can find it in the documentation page I pointed you to. So that gives you the ability to do things like drag and drop files from your desktop to cloud storage, and list buckets and objects and so on. Let's see. Comment? Okay. How experimental is logging? What are some best practices, and could you recommend some third-party services? I think logging is pretty well established at this point. I presume Dan is referring to our logging feature, and so just to explain for anybody who's not aware of it, we have a feature called access logs, which give you the ability to get information about who's, like, kind of low-level tracking information about every access to your buckets and your objects. And that information gets posted periodically to a separate bucket that you define, and it gives you fine-grained kind of ability to monitor what the activity is on your resources. I'm not sure about the experimental status, like where that is and when that's supposed to be changing. Do you know anything about that, Vilay?
I'm sorry, I was actually chatting with Hal there about the airline, so I was spacing for a second. Can you just read the question?
How experimental is logging?
It should be pretty well established. We are always taking feature requests, but we feel like it's pretty well baked in there. I mean, once again, it'd be nice to know if there's some particular issues or feature enhancements that people are looking for.
Right. And then I don't have any particular recommendations for third-party services in the logging space, but as Vilay mentioned, if you'd care to share a little bit more information about what you're trying to do with the logging feature, we can definitely try to explain that better. How to start cloud storage use in Google App Engine? So there is actually an API in App Engine, integrated right into App Engine for interacting with Google Cloud Storage. And I think if you search on Google Cloud Storage App Engine, you'll very likely find it in one of the top returned hits. That's probably the best way to interact with Google Cloud Storage. That's supported in both Java and Python. You may find cases where you need to do something that is outside of the scope of what's supported by that API, and there are ways to kind of work around the API or circumvent it and go directly to the programming interface we have supported for cloud storage. But the best way to start would be, without knowing more about what you're trying to do, the best way to start would be to look at the published API that's built right into App Engine and see if that does what you need. The next one is a Google Drive question. Someone's asking when there'll be a Linux version of Google Drive, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not sort of outside the scope of this talk. So unfortunately for Adita, I'm going to have to skip that one. Sorry. Is Cname redirection with HTTPS on the roadmap? That's a pretty relevant question to what I've been talking about, and I don't know the answer to that. In general, we don't reveal future plans. We're not allowed to talk about what we're going to do down the road, but we've heard of this before. We're aware that this is an important capability, so we're taking it into consideration for our future planning. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that, Vile?
Nope, that's pretty much.
So it's a good point, and we agree it seems like a very useful thing to be able to do. Do Google Cloud Storage domain name CNames need to be associated with a Google App account? I think the answer to that is no. You can have I'm not sure, I guess, what Adam means exactly by a Google App account, whether you mean like a Google App for Domains type account or just a Gmail account, a Google account. I guess I'm going to assume it's a Google account, just proper, like a Gmail ID or something like that. The Cname capability is independent of the Gmail or the Google IDs. Basically, you'll create a domain name, and you'll have to prove ownership of that. I'm trying to think if you need a Google account in order to, you might need a Google account in order to actually do the verification steps, because the way that works is you go to Google Webmaster Tools and you go through kind of an interactive wizard on that web page that steps you through the different ways to verify your domain. So that might be one place where you need a Google account. Like some of these other questions, if there's something you're trying to do that makes this a problem, let us know, and we'll try to see if there's a workaround. Let's see. Any questions on the Hangout before I keep going here? Okay. And I see lots of activity in the chat window. I won't try to recap that, but thanks, Vile, for helping out over there. Are there any plans to allow any edge-cached copies of GCS objects to be cleared programmatically, overriding the original cache control header? Not that I'm aware of. I think your only option at the moment is to use conservative values in terms of the life of the object and wait for it to time out. I guess I'm curious to know whether there's a problem there or what the application need is that would motivate that. But as of now, the edge caching.
That was my question, and the problem is when people make mistakes. So if you have some content that's supposed to be served up with a long lifetime, and you like the edge caching and everything, but then you realize, oops, that was wrong. And you're not using strongly named objects or something, then it would be nice. It's not a must-have feature. We can make do without it, but it would be nice to be able to say, actually, guys, we didn't mean that. Can you clear the edge cache so we can serve up the new thing under that name that we meant in the first place?
Right. So right now it's a little difficult, and with the caching, obviously, especially when it's distributed caching like on the internet, it's very, very difficult. We could certainly go ahead and maybe do a little bit on our end, but even then, you would have any problem with any intermediary caches along the way.
Yeah, understood. I mean, even if it were best efforts, it would still be a useful feature for us.
Yep.
But I do understand it's hard.
Is there a way to kind of modify the cache by changing the lifetime to a very small number? The header that dictates how long the cached element should be retained.
Once you've set it to a big number and it's been cached, the problem is that cache then knows its age. It doesn't need to check back with the actual canonical storage for that object.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
It's the same problem as with the DNS. Oops.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And we've made that mistake too.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. That's actually a good point. I meant to point that out. Like, one of the biggest gotchas that people run into, like I was walking through talking through the Cname redirection business early on in the Tech Talk portion of this hangout, and I wanted to mention that, like, when you're doing that, be liberal about how much time you wait for things to change, for the world to reconfigure. What will happen is typically, especially for example, setting up a Cname record in DNS, you'll go to your name registrar and make that change, administer DNS with that text record, for example, or the Cname record, and then you'll go try it and it won't work, and it's just because of the nature of DNS. It takes a while for things to propagate. So use liberal test intervals when you're doing that stuff. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Any other questions from the Hangout?
I joined the Hangout late. I was watching the video, so you might have said this already. But I think the question you handled the question from moderator earlier about an extra step of verification when you're deleting objects through the web interface cloud storage. And I think what the person was getting at was just an "Are you sure?" yes or no. If you click the delete button in the web interface, rather than anything to do with two-step verification, which is what I think you might have thought.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for correcting that. I think you're right.
Because also, I would like that feature. It sounds like a really small thing, but the web interface is really convenient. But at the moment, I sometimes daren't use it because I'm worried about hitting that button with no "Are you sure?" step.
Right. Okay.
You need a safe. You'd like a safety.
I'm even thinking of writing a Chrome extension just to give me an "Are you sure?" button.
Yeah, and I think that as the scope of deletion increases, that becomes even more critical. And then you can sort of take that idea even further and imagine a trash can type model where the stuff that you delete doesn't actually get deleted. It goes somewhere else outside of your normal view, and then later on, if you decide you made a mistake, you can restore it. I think those are all good ideas, and I personally would love to see more of that. So, like I said earlier, I can't give any specifics, but that's a great point, and thank you for clarifying that question. I think we misinterpreted it.
And just to extend a little bit, I mean, we did talk about at the I/O that we're going to have versioning coming very, very soon. So if you can basically go and set a bucket to go and have versions. So we keep copies for you.
Yeah, that sounds useful.
Yep. So if you're interested in being a participant when it becomes available, just go and send a note to gs-team@google.com, and we can go and put you on to when it becomes available shortly.
Thanks, Vivek.
Yep.
Next question is, has anyone worked on porting the OAuth 2 Bodo plugin to Bodo itself? And how would you pass in the access token during runtime in non-Google App Engine projects? For example, a vanilla Django project. So the second part of the question, how would you pass the access token during runtime? There are ways to get, I assume this is a Python programmer because I see the references to Bodo. There are ways to get access to the inner OAuth goodies. Sorry? I thought maybe we had got lucky again and had the questioner in the Hangout. So there are ways to get access to the refresh token and the access token and extract it from the underlying kind of library wrappers that make the OAuth 2 stuff easier to use, both in Bodo and also using the Google Python client library. As far as porting the OAuth 2 Bodo plugin to Bodo itself, what that's about, in case anybody's wondering what that's talking about, is so the tool that I showed you earlier, GSUtil, is a Python application that we've open sourced, and it's layered on top of Bodo, which is a popular third-party, also open source Python programming library. The purpose of Bodo is to make it easy to do cloud computing, to develop cloud computing apps using Python, and it supports Amazon stuff as well as Google Cloud Storage and a few other things. And GSUtil, the tool I was using earlier, uses Bodo. In order to make it work with Google Cloud Storage, we did some work in Bodo, and other people did as well, to make Bodo understand how to interact with Google Cloud Storage. One of the things that we had to sort of teach Bodo how to do was to get OAuth 2 credentials. And that part of the puzzle was done in the GSUtil command itself. So it's not like baked into the lower level Bodo library. And the person's asking, has any work been done to sort of move that functionality down into Bodo? And it's been something we've thought about, and also it kind of makes sense to us, but we haven't actually worked on that. And Bodo and GSUtil both being open source projects, we would totally be happy to invite and review any work that anybody wanted to do in that space if you were enthusiastic about helping in that area. Doesn't mean we won't do it or somebody else won't do it. It's just we haven't gotten to it up to this point. Let's see, down to two more questions here. Integration with page speed. Can't get it to work. So PageSpeed is a Google service that speeds up. I guess I don't know too much about it, but my understanding is it analyzes your content, your website content, and helps you optimize the download speed by doing things like minimizing JavaScript syntax and other techniques. Maybe somebody on the Hangout knows more. Feel free to jump in if you do. I assume this person's... Go ahead. Sounded like you had a comment there? No. Sorry if I'm interrupting anybody. I think there's a bit of delay on this line. I assume the questioner is saying specifically page speed with respect to the website configuration feature I've been talking about. So I'd like to know more about what didn't work for you. But I will reach out to the questioner after the call and try to find out about that, because it sounds like an interesting area that I haven't tried myself. Has client software of Windows been launched?
I've got an answer for that one.
Okay. Let me get you on camera here.
Hi, I'm Jeff Silverman, and I'm a developer support specialist, and I got the GSUtil utility working quite nicely under Windows and Cygwin.
Thanks, Jeff. So that's another option you have. GSUtil, the tool I was using earlier, can be run on Windows as well. In fact, it can be run without Cygwin, but I think it works a little bit. It's a little bit easier.
It works a lot better with Cygwin.
With Cygwin. That's the end of the question list. I think maybe I'm just checking to see if a couple more might have popped up in the meantime. Any alternatives to Google Storage Manager? So that's the web user interface. And there are commercial products that are available and support Google Cloud Storage. So there are a few third-party alternatives out there, and if you Google cloud storage, Google Cloud Storage, web UI, something along those lines, you should be able to find a few. but there's no alternative that's officially supported as of now by Google. And let's see, I think that pretty much covers the moderator questions. So we're coming up towards the end of the hour. We have about 5 minutes left. I'll just open it up one more time for any questions in the Hangout, and then I think we'll close up shop here. Any other questions live? Okay, well, thank you guys all for joining us today. Hope you got something out of it, and we'll try to do more of these in the future.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.